Welcome to ASMR History Whisperer, where the secrets of the past come alive in a whisper. Relax as we explore the stories that shaped our world. The history of sex. Sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence, intertwined with our biology, culture, and identity. From the earliest days of humanity, sex has not only been a means of reproduction but also a powerful force shaping societies, beliefs, and personal relationships. Throughout history, attitudes towards sex and sexuality have evolved, reflecting changes in religion, politics, science, and culture. Today, we live in a world where discussions about sex are more open and diverse than ever before, but understanding how we arrived here requires a journey through the past. In this video, we will explore the history of sex and human sexuality through 10 key turning points that have defined and redefined our understanding of this essential aspect of life. We'll begin with the prehistoric and ancient sexual practices, where early humans developed rituals and beliefs around fertility and reproduction. From there, we'll delve into the profound influence of religion on sexuality, examining how major faiths like Christianity and Islam shape societal norms. We'll look at sexuality in classical civilizations like Greece and Rome, where concepts of love, marriage, and homosexuality were explored in ways that still resonate today. Moving into the Middle Ages, we'll see how the Catholic Church imposed strict controls over sexual behavior, followed by the shifts in attitudes during the Renaissance and Reformation. The Enlightenment will show us the birth of modern sexuality as secular and scientific perspectives began to emerge. The Victorian era will reveal the contradictions of repression and the rise of sexual science, setting the stage for the sexual revolution of the 20th century, a time of dramatic change influenced by the birth control pill, feminism, and the fight for gay rights. We'll also explore the impact of technology on sexuality, including the internet and dating apps, and conclude with contemporary issues where ongoing debates about gender identity, LGBTQ+ rights, and sexual freedom continue to shape our world. Throughout this exploration, we'll discuss key figures like Sigmund Freud, who revolutionized our understanding of human sexuality, Margaret Sanger, who fought for birth control and women's reproductive rights, and Alfred Kinsey, whose groundbreaking research challenged societal norms. We'll also examine the influence of cultural icons, from ancient fertility goddesses to modern-day movements that have redefined what it means to be sexual beings. So, sit back, relax, and let's take a journey through the history of human sexuality, a journey that reflects not just the evolution of our desires and practices, but the very essence of who we are as a species. Prehistoric and ancient sexual practices, the dawn of human sexuality. In the vast expanse of human history, the way our ancestors understood and practiced sexuality has evolved dramatically. Long before the advent of written language, organized religion, or complex societies, sex was already a central part of human life. It wasn't just about reproduction, it was deeply intertwined with the survival, spirituality, and social cohesion of early communities. To truly understand how sexuality has shaped human history, we must first look back to the very beginnings of our species, to a time when life was simpler but every action carried profound significance. Imagine a world where survival depended entirely on the natural environment, where the changing seasons, the availability of food, and the birth of new life were all closely observed and revered. For our prehistoric ancestors, life was precarious, and the ability to reproduce was not just a personal matter but a crucial element of the community's survival. In this context, fertility was a powerful and almost mystical force. Early humans began to develop rituals, beliefs, and symbols centered around fertility, which were often closely linked to sexuality. One of the most striking examples of how ancient people revered fertility and sexuality can be seen in the Venus figurines. These small statues, often depicting women with exaggerated breasts, hips, and bellies, have been found across Europe, dating back as far as 35,000 years. The most famous of these, the Venus of Willendorf, is a small, rounded figure that scholars believe represents fertility, abundance, and the life-giving power of the female form. The emphasis on the female body in these figurines suggests that early human societies saw women's reproductive abilities as central to the continuation of their people. Sexuality in these prehistoric communities was likely not just a private act, but a communal one, tied to the rhythms of nature and the needs of the group. Some anthropologists suggest that early humans may have engaged in communal sexual rituals, possibly as part of fertility rites to ensure successful harvests, healthy births, and the protection of the tribe. These rituals could have been seen as a way to align the community with the forces of nature, to invoke the favor of the gods or spirits, and to strengthen the bonds within the group. As human societies transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherer groups to more settled agricultural communities, the role of sexuality continued to evolve. With the advent of agriculture, people began to stay in one place, leading to the development of more complex social structures. This shift brought about changes in how sexuality was understood and regulated. In these early agrarian societies, sex was still closely linked to fertility and survival, but it also began to take on new meanings related to property, inheritance, and social status. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the world's earliest civilizations, sexuality was both a private and public matter, deeply intertwined with religion and governance. The Mesopotamians believed that their gods were sexual beings, and many of their myths involve stories of divine love and procreation. For example, the goddess Ishtar, who was associated with love, beauty, sex, and fertility, played a central role in many Mesopotamian myths. Temples dedicated to Ishtar often included rituals that celebrated sexuality, and it's believed that some of these rituals may have involved forms of sacred prostitution, where sexual acts were performed as a form of worship or to bring blessings upon the community. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was also deeply connected to religion and the divine order. The Egyptians believed that their gods engaged in sexual acts that were vital to maintaining the balance of the universe. Myths about the gods often included sexual themes, such as the story of Osiris and Isis, where Isis uses her sexual power to resurrect Osiris, ensuring the continuation of life. Sexuality in Egypt was seen as a positive and necessary force, integral to both the physical and spiritual worlds. However, as these early societies grew more complex, so too did their attitudes towards sexuality. With the rise of large urban centers and the accumulation of wealth, issues of property, inheritance, and social order became more important. As a result, sexuality began to be more strictly regulated. Marriage, which had once been a relatively informal arrangement, became a more formalized institution, with clear rules about who could marry whom and under what circumstances. These rules were often designed to ensure that property and lineage were passed down in a controlled manner, reflecting the growing importance of social hierarchy and economic stability. In the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished around 3300 to 1300 BCE in what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, sexuality was also intertwined with spiritual beliefs. Archaeological evidence suggests that the people of the Indus Valley practiced forms of sexual symbolism in their art and possibly in their religious rituals. Seals and sculptures from the region often depict scenes of fertility, and some scholars believe that these images reflect a reverence for the sexual and reproductive powers of the human body. As we explore these ancient societies, it becomes clear that sexuality was never just about the physical act of sex. It was deeply embedded in the social, religious, and economic fabric of early human communities. These early practices and beliefs laid the foundation for the complex attitudes towards sex that would develop in later civilizations, shaping how societies understood and regulated this fundamental aspect of human life. Now that we have a deeper understanding of how sexuality was perceived and practiced in prehistoric and ancient times, we can move on to explore how major religions began to influence and regulate sexual behavior as human societies continued to evolve. The influence of religion on sexuality, shaping morality and behavior. As human societies grew more complex, the role of religion in shaping attitudes towards sex and sexuality became increasingly significant. Religions provided not only a framework for understanding the world and humanity's place in it, but also established moral codes that dictated how people should behave, including in matters of sex. The influence of major world religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, on sexual norms cannot be overstated. These religious traditions have shaped not only individual behavior but also societal expectations and laws concerning sexuality for millennia. In many ways, religion became the primary vehicle through which societies communicated and enforced their views on sexuality. This often involved defining what was considered acceptable or unacceptable sexual behavior, as well as determining the roles of men and women within these frameworks. The impact of these religious teachings has been profound, influencing everything from marriage customs to legal systems, and their echoes are still felt in modern society. Christianity, sexual morality, and the body. Christianity, which emerged in the 1st century CE in the Roman Empire, had a profound impact on Western attitudes towards sex. Early Christian teachings on sexuality were heavily influenced by Jewish traditions, but they also incorporated elements of Greco-Roman thought, particularly the idea of the body as a vessel of purity or corruption. The teachings of Jesus Christ emphasized spiritual purity and often encouraged celibacy as an ideal state, especially for those devoted to religious life. This emphasis on celibacy and chastity became a cornerstone of Christian sexual ethics, particularly in the early church. The Apostle Paul, one of the most influential figures in early Christianity, advocated for sexual restraint and viewed marriage as a necessary but less spiritually ideal state compared to celibacy. His letters to early Christian communities, which form a significant part of the New Testament, reinforced the idea that sexual activity should be confined within marriage and that it should serve primarily for procreation. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and later into Europe, these teachings became deeply embedded in the social fabric. The Church began to exert significant control over sexual behavior, promoting the idea that sex outside of marriage was sinful and that even within marriage, sexual activity should be approached with caution and moderation. This led to the development of a moral code that heavily emphasized the importance of sexual purity, particularly for women. Virginity and chastity were extolled as virtues, and women who remained virgins were often celebrated within the Christian community. The concept of original sin, which held that all humans were born with an inherent tendency towards sin because of Adam and Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, also played a crucial role in shaping Christian views on sexuality. According to this doctrine, sexual desire was often seen as a manifestation of humanity's fallen nature. The Church's focus on controlling sexual behavior was, in part, an effort to combat this inherent sinfulness and to guide believers toward a more spiritual, less corporeal existence. Over the centuries, these teachings were codified into church doctrine and canon law, influencing the development of Western legal systems and societal norms. The medieval period, in particular, saw the Church exerting significant influence over laws governing marriage, divorce, and sexual behavior. For instance, the Church's opposition to divorce became enshrined in many European legal systems, and its teachings on the sanctity of marriage influenced everything from property rights to inheritance laws. Islam, sexuality, and the law. Islam, which emerged in the 7th century CE in the Arabian Peninsula, also had a profound impact on sexual norms in the regions where it spread. The Quran, Islam's holy book, and the Hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, provide detailed guidance on sexual behavior, marriage, and family life. In Islam, marriage is highly encouraged and seen as a contract between two individuals. The Quran speaks of marriage as a means of emotional and spiritual fulfillment, and it provides guidelines for the rights and responsibilities of both husbands and wives. Unlike in Christianity, where celibacy is often idealized, Islam views marriage and sexual relations within marriage as natural and healthy aspects of life. Sexual pleasure is recognized and valued within the bounds of marriage, and both men and women are encouraged to find fulfillment in their marital relationships. However, Islam also imposes strict guidelines on sexual behavior outside of marriage. Adultery and fornication are considered serious sins, and the Sharia, or Islamic law, prescribes severe punishments for those found guilty of these acts. The emphasis on modesty and the segregation of genders in many Muslim societies reflects the importance placed on sexual morality and the protection of women's honor. Modesty, particularly for women, is emphasized through the practice of wearing the hijab or other forms of covering, which is seen as a way to maintain purity and prevent immoral behavior. Polygamy is another aspect of Islamic sexual ethics that has been the subject of much discussion and interpretation. The Quran permits a man to marry up to 4 wives, provided he can treat them all equally. This practice, while not as common in the modern world, was historically significant in many Islamic societies, where it was often linked to social and economic factors. Polygamy was seen as a way to ensure the care and protection of women, particularly widows and orphans, in a society where male guardianship was considered essential. Islamic teachings on sexuality also emphasize the importance of family and the continuity of the community. The family is viewed as the cornerstone of society, and sexual relations within marriage are seen as a way to strengthen family bonds and ensure the continuation of the Muslim Ummah, or community of believers. Hinduism, sexuality, and the divine. Hinduism, one of the world's oldest religions, offers a complex and nuanced view of sexuality that is deeply intertwined with its spiritual teachings. Unlike many other religious traditions, Hinduism does not have a single founder or a unified set of doctrines, which allows for a wide variety of beliefs and practices related to sexuality. In Hinduism, sexuality is often associated with the divine, and it is seen as a powerful force that can be both creative and destructive. The concept of kama, one of the 4 purusharthas or aims of life, represents pleasure, love, and desire, including sexual desire. Kama is considered a legitimate pursuit in life, alongside dharma, duty, artha, prosperity, and moksha, spiritual liberation. The ancient text, the Kama Sutra, is perhaps the most well-known exploration of sexuality in Hinduism, offering guidance on sexual pleasure, love, and relationships. Far from being a mere manual of eroticism, the Kama Sutra is a philosophical text that explores the role of desire in human life and how it can be pursued in harmony with other aspects of existence. The Hindu pantheon includes deities that embody and celebrate sexuality. For instance, Shiva, one of the principal gods in Hinduism, is often depicted with his consort, Parvati, in an embrace, symbolizing the union of male and female energies. This union is seen as the source of all creation, reflecting the belief that sexuality is a divine and creative force. The worship of the lingam and yoni, representations of the male and female sexual organs, further emphasizes the sacredness of sexuality in Hindu thought. However, Hinduism also places importance on the control and sublimation of sexual desires. The practice of celibacy, particularly for those pursuing spiritual enlightenment, is highly valued. Many Hindu ascetics, known as sadhus, take vows of celibacy as part of their spiritual discipline, believing that sexual energy can be transformed into spiritual energy through practices like yoga and meditation. This dual view of sexuality as both a natural and divine force, and as something that can be transcended for spiritual growth, reflects the complexity of Hindu teachings on the subject. Buddhism, desire and the path to enlightenment. Buddhism, which emerged in the 5th century BCE in what is now Nepal and India, offers a unique perspective on sexuality, one that is closely tied to its teachings on desire and suffering. The Buddha taught that desire, or tanha, is one of the root causes of suffering in the world, and that overcoming desire is essential for achieving enlightenment or nirvana. This includes sexual desire, which is seen as a powerful force that can distract individuals from the path to spiritual liberation. In Buddhism, celibacy is often considered an ideal, particularly for monks and nuns who have dedicated their lives to the pursuit of enlightenment. The monastic code, or Vinaya, includes strict rules regarding sexual behavior, and monastics are expected to abstain from all sexual activity. For lay people, Buddhism encourages a balanced approach to sexuality, emphasizing the importance of ethical conduct and the avoidance of harmful or exploitative relationships. Despite its emphasis on celibacy and the dangers of desire, Buddhism does not view sex as inherently sinful or wrong. Instead, it is seen as a natural part of life that can be approached mindfully and ethically. The key is to avoid becoming attached to sexual pleasure in a way that leads to suffering or harm. In some Buddhist traditions, sexuality is even integrated into spiritual practice, particularly in the esoteric practices of Tibetan Buddhism, where rituals involving sexual union are seen as a means of achieving spiritual enlightenment. Sexuality in classical civilizations, love, power, and society in ancient Greece and Rome. As we move from the religious influence on sexuality, the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome offer a fascinating glimpse into how these ancient societies approached love, marriage, and sexual behavior. These cultures, known for their contributions to philosophy, politics, and art, also developed complex and often contrasting views on sexuality, intertwining it with concepts of power, social status, and personal identity. The legacy of these views has endured for centuries, influencing Western thought and norms about sex and relationships. Ancient Greece, the pursuit of eros. In ancient Greece, sexuality was seen as a fundamental aspect of human life, deeply connected to the concepts of beauty, love, and the divine. The Greeks worshipped Eros, the god of love and desire, who was believed to be a powerful force capable of inspiring both passionate love and destructive obsession. The pursuit of Eros, or romantic and sexual love, was considered a natural and desirable part of life, particularly among the elite classes. One of the most distinctive aspects of Greek sexuality was the practice of pederasty, a socially acknowledged relationship between an adult man and a younger male, typically in his teens. This relationship was often educational and mentorship-oriented, with the older man providing guidance and instruction to the youth, who was seen as being at the cusp of manhood. While these relationships had a sexual component, they were also deeply tied to the social and intellectual development of the younger male. Pederasty was not seen as conflicting with marriage. In fact, many men who engaged in these relationships were also married to women. The Greeks also had a complex view of women and their role in society. In many city-states, such as Athens, women were expected to be chaste and modest, their primary role being to bear and raise children. Marriage was often arranged, with little emphasis on romantic love. Women's sexuality was tightly controlled, as it was linked to issues of inheritance and legitimacy. However, in other parts of Greece, such as Sparta, women had more freedom and were even encouraged to engage in physical exercise and education, reflecting a society that valued strength and the production of healthy offspring. The Greeks' understanding of sexuality was also reflected in their mythology and literature. Myths were filled with stories of gods and mortals engaging in various forms of sexual behavior, often highlighting the power dynamics and consequences of such acts. For example, the myth of Zeus and Ganymede tells of the king of the gods falling in love with a beautiful mortal boy, abducting him to serve as his cupbearer on Mount Olympus. This story, like many others in Greek mythology, illustrates the intertwining of power, desire, and divinity in Greek thought. In literature, the works of poets such as Sappho of Lesbos explored themes of love and desire, often focusing on same-sex relationships. Sappho's poetry, much of which survives only in fragments, expresses deep emotional longing and affection for other women, offering a rare glimpse into the experiences and feelings of women in ancient Greece. Her work has become iconic, symbolizing the rich and diverse nature of Greek attitudes towards sexuality. Ancient Rome, power and patriarchy. Roman society, while heavily influenced by Greek culture, developed its own distinct views on sexuality. In Rome, sex was closely linked to concepts of power, status, and control. The Roman household, or familia, was headed by the paterfamilias, the male head of the family who held nearly absolute authority over his household, including the sexual behavior of its members. Marriage in Rome was often a matter of political and social alliance rather than romantic love. Marriages were typically arranged to strengthen familial ties and secure political power. Roman women, like their Greek counterparts, were expected to be chaste and loyal, and their primary role was to produce legitimate heirs. However, Roman women of the upper classes did enjoy certain freedoms, including the ability to own property and engage in social activities, though their sexual behavior was still subject to strict scrutiny. For Roman men, sexual relations were often seen as an expression of dominance and control. The Roman concept of virtus, or manly virtue, was closely tied to a man's ability to assert his power, both in the public sphere and in his private life. This led to a societal acceptance of sexual relationships that reinforced the social hierarchy. For example, it was socially acceptable for a Roman man to engage in sexual relations with slaves, prostitutes, or other men, provided that he was the dominant partner in the interaction. The idea was that the man's status should never be compromised by his sexual behavior. As long as he remained in control, his actions were deemed acceptable. Unlike in Greece, where pederasty was a formalized institution, Roman attitudes towards same-sex relationships were more pragmatic and less idealized. While relationships between men were not uncommon, they were often viewed through the lens of power and status. The passive partner in a same-sex relationship, particularly if he was a freeborn Roman citizen, could be subject to social disapproval, as this was seen as compromising his manly virtue. Roman literature and art often depicted sexual themes in a direct and sometimes explicit manner. The poet Ovid, in his work Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, offered advice on love and seduction, reflecting the sophisticated and, at times, libertine attitudes of Roman society. The famous frescoes of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, depict a wide range of sexual acts, indicating that the Romans were not shy about displaying their sexual culture. However, as the Roman Empire expanded and later transitioned into the Christian era, attitudes towards sexuality began to shift. The influence of Christian morality, with its emphasis on chastity, celibacy, and the regulation of sexual behavior, started to permeate Roman society, leading to a gradual transformation of sexual norms. The classical civilizations of Greece and Rome offer a complex and multifaceted view of sexuality, where love, power, and societal norms were deeply intertwined. These cultures laid the groundwork for many of the attitudes and beliefs that would later be adopted and modified by Western societies, particularly as Christianity began to rise and exert its influence. Next, we will explore how the Middle Ages saw a tightening of sexual norms and behaviors, particularly under the influence of the Catholic Church, which sought to control and regulate sexuality in ways that would shape European society for centuries to come. The Middle Ages and the Church's control, chastity, celibacy, and sexual morality. As we move into the Middle Ages, the role of sexuality in society underwent significant changes, largely driven by the influence of the Catholic Church. With the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christian dominance in Europe, attitudes towards sex became increasingly regulated and moralized. The Church, which emerged as a central authority in medieval Europe, sought to impose strict controls over sexual behavior, viewing it through the lens of sin, morality, and divine law. This period saw the development of a rigid sexual ethic that would dominate European thought for centuries. Chastity and celibacy, the ideal of sexual purity. In the early Christian Church, the teachings of Jesus and the writings of the apostles laid the foundation for the Church's views on sexuality. These teachings emphasized spiritual purity, often advocating for celibacy as the highest form of devotion to God. The idea that sexual desire was inherently linked to humanity's fallen nature, stemming from the concept of original sin, became deeply ingrained in Christian doctrine. This belief led to the elevation of virginity and chastity as virtues, particularly among those who dedicated their lives to religious service. Monasticism, which emerged in the early centuries of Christianity, became a powerful movement during the Middle Ages. Monks and nuns took vows of celibacy, renouncing all sexual relations as part of their commitment to a life of prayer, contemplation, and service to God. Celibacy was seen as a way to transcend the physical and focus entirely on the spiritual. The monastic life was idealized as the purest form of Christian living, and those who adhered to its strictures were often revered as holy figures. The Church's emphasis on celibacy extended beyond the monastic orders to the clergy as well. By the 11th century, the Church had formally established celibacy as a requirement for all priests in the Western Christian Church, a rule that remains in place for Roman Catholic priests to this day. This decision was driven by a desire to ensure the spiritual purity of the clergy and to prevent issues related to inheritance and property, which could arise if priests were allowed to marry and have legitimate heirs. For the laity, chastity was also highly valued, particularly for women. The Virgin Mary, who was venerated as the Mother of God, became the ultimate symbol of female purity and virtue. Women were expected to remain virgins until marriage and to be faithful to their husbands thereafter. The Church's teachings on marriage emphasized that the primary purpose of sex was procreation, and any sexual activity outside of this purpose, such as contraception or sex for pleasure, was considered sinful. The ideal of chastity was so deeply ingrained in medieval society that it influenced every aspect of life, from literature and art to law and social customs. The concept of courtly love, which emerged in the medieval literature of Europe, particularly in the works of troubadours and poets, idealized the love between a knight and a noblewoman as pure, spiritual, and often unconsummated. This notion of love was more about admiration and service than physical desire, reflecting the Church's teachings on the importance of chastity and the control of sexual impulses. Marriage and sexuality, a sacrament and a duty. While celibacy and chastity were idealized, the Church also recognized that marriage was a necessary institution for the continuation of society. However, the Church sought to impose strict controls over marriage, viewing it not just as a social contract but as a sacred sacrament. The sacrament of marriage was seen as a reflection of the relationship between Christ and the Church, and thus it was to be treated with utmost seriousness and respect. The Church established clear rules about who could marry, under what conditions, and how marriages could be dissolved. Consanguinity laws, which prohibited marriage between close relatives, were strictly enforced, and marriage was generally considered indissoluble. Divorce was not permitted, except under very specific circumstances, such as cases of impotence or failure to consummate the marriage. Annulments, rather than divorces, were granted by the Church in cases where a marriage was deemed invalid from the start. The Church's teachings on sexuality within marriage were equally strict. Sex was permitted only within the confines of marriage, and even then, it was to be approached with caution. The primary purpose of sexual relations was procreation, and anything that deviated from this purpose, such as the use of contraception, oral sex, or anal sex, was considered sinful. The Church also discouraged excessive sexual activity, even within marriage, warning against the dangers of lust and the temptations of the flesh. These teachings were enforced through various means, including confession, penance, and the threat of excommunication. The Church wielded significant power over the lives of the faithful, and sexual sins were taken very seriously. The fear of damnation and the promise of salvation were powerful motivators for adherence to the Church's moral code. The influence of the Inquisition and moral policing. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of the Inquisition, a powerful tool used by the Church to enforce orthodoxy and combat heresy. While the Inquisition is most often associated with the persecution of heretics, it also played a role in policing sexual behavior. The Church was deeply concerned with maintaining moral purity among its followers, and the Inquisition sought to root out those who engaged in sexual practices that were deemed deviant or heretical. One of the most notorious aspects of the Inquisition was its persecution of those accused of witchcraft. Many of those accused of witchcraft were women, and the charges often involved allegations of sexual misconduct, such as having sexual relations with the devil or using sorcery to seduce men. The church viewed these acts as grave sins, and those found guilty were often subjected to severe punishment, including torture and execution. The Inquisition also targeted those who engaged in practices that were seen as contrary to the Church's teachings on sexuality. Homosexuality, for example, was harshly condemned by the Church, and those accused of engaging in same-sex relationships could be punished by death. The Church's teachings on sexual morality were enforced through a combination of legal, social, and religious pressures, creating a culture of fear and repression. The legacy of medieval sexual morality. The sexual ethic that developed during the Middle Ages had a profound and lasting impact on European society. The Church's teachings on chastity, celibacy, and the sanctity of marriage became deeply ingrained in the cultural and legal frameworks of the time, shaping attitudes towards sex and sexuality for centuries to come. This period also saw the consolidation of many of the sexual taboos and norms that continue to influence Western societies today. The emphasis on sexual restraint, the idealization of virginity, and the regulation of sexual behavior through religious and legal means became central to the social order of medieval Europe. These ideas would later be challenged and reinterpreted during the Renaissance and Reformation, but their influence remains evident in modern attitudes towards sex and morality. As we move forward, we will explore how the Renaissance and Reformation periods began to challenge and transform these medieval views on sexuality, leading to the development of more modern perspectives on sex, love, and human relationships. The Renaissance and Reformation, reawakening and reforming sexuality. As Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and Reformation periods brought significant changes to many aspects of life, including views on sexuality. The Renaissance, beginning in the 14th century and lasting into the 17th century, was a time of cultural rebirth, where art, science, and humanism flourished. The Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, was a religious movement that sought to reform the Catholic Church and led to the rise of Protestantism. Both of these movements had profound impacts on how sex and sexuality were understood and expressed. The Renaissance, rediscovering the body and human desire. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanism and the rediscovery of classical antiquity, brought about a shift in how people viewed the body, beauty, and sexuality. Inspired by the art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, Renaissance thinkers began to explore and celebrate the human form in ways that had been largely suppressed during the Middle Ages. In art, the human body was depicted with a new sense of realism and beauty. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael portrayed the human form in all its glory, emphasizing its physical perfection and sensuality. Michelangelo's statue of David, for example, is not only a masterpiece of Renaissance art but also a celebration of the male body as a symbol of strength, beauty, and human potential. The naked form was no longer seen solely as a source of shame or sin, but as a subject worthy of admiration and study. This period also saw renewed interest in classical mythology, which often included themes of love, lust, and eroticism. Works like Botticelli's The Birth of Venus and Titian's Venus of Urbino portrayed sensual scenes from mythology, reflecting a more open and appreciative attitude towards sexuality. The erotic became a legitimate subject of artistic expression, and sexuality was increasingly viewed as a natural and even divine aspect of human life. Literature, too, reflected these changing attitudes. The works of poets and writers such as Petrarch, Boccaccio, and later Shakespeare often explored themes of love, desire, and the complexities of human relationships. Boccaccio's Decameron, a collection of tales written in the 14th century, is particularly notable for its candid and often humorous depictions of love and sex. These stories, set against the backdrop of the Black Death, provide a glimpse into the diverse and sometimes contradictory views on sexuality during the Renaissance. The influence of humanism during the Renaissance also led to a more individualistic approach to life and personal relationships. Humanists emphasized the importance of personal experience and individual fulfillment, including in matters of love and sexuality. This focus on the individual led to a greater acceptance of romantic love as a basis for marriage, in contrast to the more utilitarian and arranged marriages of the medieval period. While marriage remained an important social institution, the Renaissance encouraged the idea that love and mutual attraction should play a central role in choosing a partner. However, it's important to note that these more liberal attitudes towards sexuality were largely confined to the elite classes. For the majority of people, particularly women, the traditional expectations of chastity, modesty, and marital fidelity remained in place. The Renaissance brought about a reawakening of interest in the body and human desire, but it did not entirely overturn the moral codes established during the Middle Ages. The Reformation, challenging the Catholic Church's control. While the Renaissance was reshaping cultural attitudes towards sexuality, the Reformation was challenging the Catholic Church's authority over sexual morality. The Reformation began in 1517 when Martin Luther, a German monk, published his 95 Theses, criticizing the Church's practices and calling for reform. Luther's actions sparked a religious revolution that led to the creation of Protestantism and a reevaluation of many aspects of Christian doctrine, including views on sex and marriage. One of the central tenets of the Reformation was the belief that individuals could have a direct relationship with God without the need for intermediaries such as priests. This emphasis on personal faith and individual responsibility had significant implications for how sex and marriage were viewed. Protestant reformers rejected the Catholic Church's requirement of celibacy for the clergy, arguing that marriage was a natural and honorable state for all Christians, including priests. This led to the widespread practice of clerical marriage in Protestant regions, a stark contrast to the Catholic tradition. The Reformation also promoted the idea that marriage was not just a sacrament but also a social contract and partnership between equals. Protestant leaders like Luther and John Calvin emphasized the importance of mutual love, respect, and companionship in marriage rather than viewing it solely as a means of procreation. This shift in emphasis helped to elevate the status of women within marriage, as the relationship between husband and wife was seen as one of mutual support and cooperation. At the same time, the Reformation reinforced certain conservative views on sexuality. While Protestant reformers rejected many of the excesses and abuses of the Catholic Church, they maintained strict moral codes when it came to sexual behavior. Adultery, fornication, and other sexual sins were condemned, and Protestant communities often enforced these moral standards with great rigor. In many Protestant regions, the church and state worked together to regulate sexual behavior, using laws, sermons, and community discipline to ensure conformity to the new moral order. The Reformation also led to the decline of certain practices that had been tolerated or even encouraged by the Catholic Church, such as the veneration of saints and relics associated with fertility. Protestant reformers viewed these practices as superstitious and idolatrous, leading to their suppression in Protestant areas. This shift contributed to a more austere and rational approach to religion and sexuality in the Protestant world. The Renaissance and Reformation were periods of profound change that reshaped European attitudes towards sex, love, and marriage. The Renaissance brought a renewed appreciation for the beauty of the human body and the complexities of human desire, while the Reformation challenged the Catholic Church's control over sexual morality and promoted new ideas about marriage and personal responsibility. These movements laid the groundwork for the further development of sexual thought and behavior in the modern era. As we move forward, we will explore how the Enlightenment period continued to transform these ideas, leading to the birth of modern sexuality and the ongoing evolution of sexual norms. The Enlightenment and the birth of modern sexuality, reason, science, and the human body. The Enlightenment, which spanned the 17th and 18th centuries, marked a profound shift in the way people thought about the world, including sexuality. This period, often referred to as the Age of Reason, emphasized rationality, science, and the importance of individual rights. As Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge traditional authorities, including the Church, they also began to question and redefine ideas about sex, the human body, and the nature of desire. The Enlightenment laid the intellectual groundwork for many of the sexual freedoms and debates that continue to shape modern society. Rationality and the human body, a new perspective. One of the key features of the Enlightenment was the emphasis on reason and scientific inquiry. Enlightenment thinkers sought to understand the natural world, including the human body, through observation, experimentation, and logic rather than through religious doctrine or superstition. This shift had significant implications for how people viewed sex and sexuality. During this period, the human body began to be studied in more detail, with advances in anatomy and medicine providing new insights into sexual function and reproduction. Figures like William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood, and Andreas Vesalius, who published one of the most detailed anatomical studies of the human body, helped to demystify the body and its functions. These developments led to a more secular understanding of sex, moving away from the idea of sexuality as inherently sinful and toward a view of it as a natural and healthy part of human life. The Enlightenment also brought about changes in attitudes toward women's bodies and their roles in society. The period saw the rise of feminist thought, with writers like Mary Wollstonecraft advocating for women's rights, including the right to education and personal autonomy. Wollstonecraft's seminal work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, argued that women should not be treated as mere objects of male desire, but as rational beings capable of contributing to society on equal terms with men. This was a radical departure from the traditional view of women as passive and subordinate, and it laid the foundation for later feminist movements. Sexuality during the Enlightenment was also influenced by the idea of the natural rights of individuals. Philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that all people have certain inherent rights, including the right to personal freedom and autonomy. These ideas began to challenge the traditional moral and legal restrictions on sexual behavior, leading to a more permissive attitude towards sex outside of marriage, particularly among the upper classes. The rise of sexology and the study of human sexuality. Another significant development during the Enlightenment was the emergence of sexology, the scientific study of human sexuality. While the field of sexology would not be formally established until the 19th century, the Enlightenment laid the groundwork for this new area of study by promoting the idea that human sexuality could be understood through scientific inquiry. One of the key figures in this early exploration of sexuality was the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Although Kant himself was not a sexologist, his writings on ethics and human nature had a profound impact on how sexuality was understood. Kant argued that human beings should not be treated as means to an end but as ends in themselves, a principle that would later influence debates about sexual ethics and the rights of individuals in their sexual relationships. The Enlightenment also saw the publication of some of the earliest works that explicitly addressed human sexuality. One of the most famous of these was the memoirs of Giacomo Casanova, a Venetian adventurer and writer who became synonymous with the pursuit of sexual pleasure. Casanova's memoirs, which detailed his numerous romantic and sexual escapades, challenged conventional moral standards and celebrated the pursuit of sexual pleasure as a legitimate and even admirable goal. Another influential work was Philosophy in the Bedroom by the Marquis de Sade, a French nobleman whose writings pushed the boundaries of contemporary sexual mores. De Sade's works explored themes of power, dominance, and the darker aspects of human sexuality, often in shocking and controversial ways. While de Sade was widely condemned in his time, his writings have since been recognized as important, if extreme, contributions to the discussion of human sexuality. These early explorations of sexuality laid the foundation for the development of sexology as a formal discipline in the 19th century. Researchers like Richard von Kraftebang and Havelock Ellis would later build on these ideas, using scientific methods to study sexual behavior and advocate for a more open and informed approach to sexuality. The changing role of marriage and family. The Enlightenment also brought about changes in how people viewed marriage and family life. While marriage remained an important social institution, Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge traditional views on its purpose and structure. The idea of marriage as a purely economic or political arrangement was increasingly questioned, and there was a growing emphasis on the importance of love, mutual respect, and personal happiness in marriage. The rise of individualism during the Enlightenment contributed to these changing attitudes. The idea that individuals had the right to choose their own partners and to seek personal fulfillment in their relationships became more widely accepted, particularly among the emerging middle classes. This shift was reflected in literature and art, which began to celebrate romantic love and the idea of marriage as a partnership between equals. However, it's important to note that these changes were not universally embraced. Many traditionalists continued to uphold the older, more hierarchical views of marriage, and women, in particular, still faced significant legal and social restrictions. Divorce, for example, remained difficult to obtain in most European countries, and women had few legal rights within marriage. Nevertheless, the seeds of change were sown during the Enlightenment, setting the stage for the more radical transformations that would occur in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Enlightenment was a period of intellectual and cultural transformation that profoundly influenced how people thought about sex, the human body, and relationships. The emphasis on reason, science, and individual rights led to a more secular and open approach to sexuality, challenging the religious and moral strictures of the past. As we move forward, we will explore how these Enlightenment ideas laid the groundwork for the dramatic changes in sexual norms that would occur during the Victorian era and beyond. The rise of sexual science, the development of new moral and ethical frameworks, and the growing emphasis on personal freedom and expression would continue to shape the evolution of human sexuality in the modern world. The Victorian era, repression, contradictions, and the rise of sexual science. The Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, is often characterized by its strict moral codes and conservative attitudes towards sex. This period, however, was also marked by significant contradictions. While Victorian society publicly emphasized sexual restraint and propriety, there was a thriving undercurrent of sexual exploration and a burgeoning interest in the scientific study of human sexuality. These opposing forces created a complex and often contradictory sexual culture that would have a profound impact on the modern world. Public morality and private desire. Victorian society was known for its strict moral codes, particularly concerning sex. The ideal of sexual purity, especially for women, was central to Victorian values. Women were expected to be chaste before marriage and faithful afterward, embodying the virtues of modesty, obedience, and self-restraint. The ideal Victorian woman was often depicted as the angel in the house, a moral guardian who was pure, pious, and devoted to her husband and children. Men, too, were expected to adhere to certain moral standards, though the expectations for male behavior were often more lenient. While men were generally expected to be the breadwinners and protectors of their families, they were also permitted a degree of sexual freedom that was denied to women. This double standard was evident in the widespread tolerance of prostitution, which was seen as a necessary evil to protect the purity of respectable women. Despite these strict public codes, the Victorian era was also a time of significant sexual hypocrisy. The emphasis on outward respectability often masked a thriving underworld of sexual activity. Prostitution was widespread, with estimates suggesting that tens of thousands of women worked as prostitutes in London alone. The rise of urbanization and the anonymity of city life allowed for greater sexual freedom, particularly for men. Brothels, clandestine affairs, and the production and consumption of pornography were all part of the hidden sexual landscape of the Victorian period. The tension between public morality and private desire was also reflected in literature and art. Many Victorian novels, such as Thomas Hardy's Tess of the d'Urberville and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, explored themes of sexual repression, desire, and the consequences of violating social norms. These works often highlighted the harsh realities faced by women who transgressed sexual boundaries, underscoring the strict moral codes of the time. At the same time, there was a growing fascination with the darker aspects of sexuality. The works of the Marquis de Sade, which had been largely suppressed during the Enlightenment, experienced a revival during the Victorian era, fueling interest in sadomasochism and other forms of sexual deviance. Gothic literature, with its themes of forbidden desire, violence, and the supernatural, also reflected the era's preoccupation with the darker sides of human nature. The medicalization of sexuality, the birth of sexology. One of the most significant developments of the Victorian era was the rise of sexology, the scientific study of human sexuality. This period saw the beginning of a more systematic and scientific approach to understanding sexual behavior, laying the foundation for modern sexology. The German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing was one of the pioneers of this new field. His work Psychopathia Sexualis, published in 1886, was one of the first comprehensive studies of sexual behavior, particularly what he termed sexual deviance. Krafft-Ebing classified a wide range of sexual behaviors, including homosexuality, fetishism, and sadomasochism, as mental disorders, reflecting the prevailing belief that these behaviors were pathological. While his work was heavily biased by the moral attitudes of the time, it also represented a significant step toward the scientific study of sexuality. In England, the physician Havelock Ellis emerged as another key figure in the development of sexology. His work Studies in the Psychology of Sex, published in multiple volumes between 1897 and 1928, was groundbreaking in its detailed examination of human sexual behavior. Unlike Krafft-Ebing, Ellis took a more sympathetic view of sexual diversity, arguing that many forms of sexual expression were natural and should not be pathologized. He was one of the first researchers to argue that homosexuality was not a disease but a natural variation of human sexuality. Ellis's work laid the groundwork for later sexual reform movements and contributed to a more open and informed discussion of sexuality in the 20th century. The Victorian era also saw the emergence of Sigmund Freud, whose theories on sexuality would revolutionize the way people understood the human psyche. Freud's concept of the libido, or sexual drive, was central to his theory of psychoanalysis. He argued that sexual desire was a fundamental force in human behavior, influencing everything from childhood development to adult relationships. Freud's ideas about the unconscious mind, repression, and the Oedipus complex introduced the notion that sexuality was a key component of psychological health and development. Although controversial, Freud's theories had a profound impact on both psychology and broader cultural attitudes towards sex. The hidden world of Victorian sexuality. While the Victorian era is often remembered for its sexual repression, it was also a time of significant sexual exploration, particularly in the private sphere. The strict moral codes imposed by society led many individuals to explore their sexuality in secret, often in ways that defied public norms. One example of this hidden world was the phenomenon of cross-dressing, which became increasingly common during the Victorian period. Both men and women engaged in cross-dressing, often as a form of sexual expression or rebellion against rigid gender roles. Cross-dressing balls and clubs, where individuals could dress as the opposite sex and socialize with others who shared their interests, became popular in some urban areas. These events provided a space for people to explore their identities and desires in ways that were not possible in mainstream society. Another aspect of hidden Victorian sexuality was the fascination with sexual deviance, particularly in the context of criminality and scandal. The infamous case of Jack the Ripper, who murdered several women in London's East End in 1888, captivated the public's imagination and highlighted the era's fears about sexual violence and the dangers lurking beneath the surface of respectable society. The Ripper's crimes, along with other sensational cases, fed into the Victorian obsession with the dark side of sexuality, contributing to the era's contradictory attitudes towards sex. The Victorian era was a time of profound contradictions in the realm of sexuality. On the one hand, it was an age of repression, with strict moral codes and social expectations governing sexual behavior. On the other hand, it was also a period of significant sexual exploration, both in private and in the emerging field of sexology. The tensions between public morality and private desire, as well as the growing interest in the scientific study of sex, laid the foundation for the dramatic changes in sexual attitudes and behaviors that would occur in the 20th century. As we move forward, we will explore the sexual revolution of the 20th century, a period of dramatic change that challenged the sexual norms of the past and reshaped modern attitudes towards sex, love, and relationships. The sexual revolution of the 20th century, a time of transformation. As the 20th century unfolded, the world witnessed a profound shift in attitudes towards sex and sexuality. This period, often referred to as the sexual revolution, was marked by a dramatic change in how people viewed and experienced sex, challenging long-standing norms and paving the way for greater sexual freedom and expression. The revolution was fueled by a combination of social, political, and technological developments that reshaped modern society in ways that continue to resonate today. In the early part of the century, the seeds of change were already being sown. The influence of Freud's theories on sexuality, along with the growing body of sexological research, began to challenge the repressive attitudes of the Victorian era. The works of researchers like Havelock Ellis and later Alfred Kinsey, who conducted groundbreaking studies on sexual behavior in the United States, revealed that human sexuality was far more diverse and widespread than previously acknowledged. Kinsey's reports on male and female sexuality, published in the 1940s and 1950s, shocked the public by documenting behaviors such as premarital sex, homosexuality, and extramarital affairs, suggesting that the strict moral codes many adhered to were not reflective of actual human behavior. This growing awareness was accompanied by a series of social and political changes that would further fuel the sexual revolution. The aftermath of World War II brought about significant shifts in social structures, with women entering the workforce in greater numbers and challenging traditional gender roles. The civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, and the fight for LGBTQ+ rights all contributed to a broader questioning of societal norms, including those related to sex. One of the most significant catalysts for the sexual revolution was the development and widespread availability of the birth control pill in the 1960s. For the first time, women have reliable control over their reproductive choices, allowing them greater freedom to engage in sexual relationships without the fear of unintended pregnancy. The pill was revolutionary not just in terms of contraception, but also in its impact on women's autonomy and their ability to participate more fully in the workforce and public life. The 1960s and 1970s were a time of experimentation and liberation, as the counterculture movement embraced the idea of free love and rejected the conservative values of previous generations. This period saw the rise of the hippie movement, which promoted sexual freedom as part of a broader ethos of peace, love, and personal liberation. The era was marked by an explosion of sexual expression in popular culture, with music, film, and literature increasingly pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. However, the sexual revolution was not without its challenges and controversies. The newfound sexual freedom of the 1960s and 1970s led to a backlash from conservative groups who feared that traditional values were being eroded. The rise of the religious right in the United States, for example, was partly a response to the perceived moral decline brought about by the sexual revolution. Debates over issues like abortion, pornography, and gay rights became increasingly polarized, reflecting the broader cultural and political divides of the time. The sexual revolution also had complex implications for gender relations. While it offered many women greater sexual freedom and autonomy, it also exposed them to new pressures and expectations. The idea of sexual liberation sometimes reinforced traditional gender roles, with men encouraged to be sexually assertive while women were expected to be more permissive. This tension was particularly evident in the feminist movement, where some feminists celebrated sexual freedom as a means of empowerment, while others criticized the revolution for perpetuating male dominance and objectification of women. The 1980s brought a sobering moment in the midst of the ongoing sexual revolution with the emergence of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The spread of the virus, which disproportionately affected gay men, intravenous drug users, and marginalized communities, led to a renewed focus on sexual health and safety. The epidemic challenged the assumptions of the previous decades, leading to increased awareness of the risks associated with sexual activity and a greater emphasis on safer sex practices. It also galvanized the LGBTQ+ rights movement as activists fought for greater recognition, support, and funding for AIDS research and treatment. Despite these challenges, the sexual revolution had a lasting impact on modern society. It paved the way for significant legal and social changes, including the decriminalization of homosexuality in many countries, the legalization of abortion in others, and the recognition of sexual rights as human rights. The revolution also contributed to the ongoing discussions about consent, sexual diversity, and the importance of sexual education. As the 20th century came to a close, the legacy of the sexual revolution continued to influence the way people thought about and engaged with sexuality. The advent of the internet and digital technology brought new opportunities and challenges, from the rise of online dating and pornography to the debates over privacy and the commodification of sex. The ongoing fight for LGBTQ+ rights, the #MeToo movement, and the growing recognition of the importance of sexual consent and education are all part of the complex and evolving story of human sexuality in the modern world. The sexual revolution was a time of profound change that reshaped society's attitudes towards sex, gender, and relationships. It was a period of liberation and experimentation, but also of conflict and controversy as people grappled with the implications of newfound freedoms. As we move forward, we will explore how technology and contemporary issues continue to influence and shape our understanding of sexuality in the 21st century, building on the legacy of the revolution that transformed the modern world. The impact of technology on sexuality, the digital age, and beyond. As the world moved into the 21st century, the rapid advancement of technology began to profoundly reshape every aspect of human life, including sexuality. The rise of the internet, social media, and mobile technology has revolutionized how people connect, communicate, and engage in sexual relationships. These changes have brought about both new opportunities and new challenges, as the boundaries of privacy, identity, and intimacy are continually redefined in the digital age. The internet has been one of the most transformative forces in modern sexuality. In the early days of the web, online communities began to form around shared sexual interests and identities, providing a space for people to explore their sexuality in ways that were often not possible in the offline world. Forums, chat rooms, and early social networks allowed individuals to connect with others who shared their experiences and desires, fostering a sense of community and belonging. For many, particularly those in marginalized groups, the internet offered a safe haven where they could express their sexuality without fear of judgment or discrimination. As the internet evolved, so too did the ways in which people engaged with it. The advent of online dating platforms revolutionized how people formed romantic and sexual relationships. Websites like Match.com, which launched in the mid-1990s, and later apps like Tinder and Bumble, made it easier than ever for people to meet potential partners. These platforms allowed users to connect with others based on shared interests, proximity, and compatibility, breaking down many of the traditional barriers to meeting new people. For many, online dating became a primary means of finding romantic and sexual partners, leading to significant shifts in how relationships were initiated and maintained. Social media has also played a crucial role in the evolution of modern sexuality. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have made it easier for people to share aspects of their personal lives, including their romantic and sexual experiences. The rise of selfies and the sharing of intimate moments online have contributed to a culture of visibility where the boundaries between public and private life are increasingly blurred. For some, social media has become a tool for self-expression and empowerment, allowing them to curate their sexual identities and connect with others who share their values and interests. However, this increased visibility has also raised concerns about privacy, consent, and the potential for exploitation. One of the most significant changes brought about by the digital age has been the widespread availability of pornography. The internet has made pornography more accessible than ever before, with countless websites offering a vast array of content catering to every conceivable interest and preference. This accessibility has had a profound impact on how people, particularly young people, learn about and understand sex. While some argue that pornography can be a valuable resource for exploring and understanding sexuality, others raise concerns about its impact on relationships, body image, and sexual expectations. The debate over the role of pornography in modern society continues to be a contentious issue, with no easy answers. The digital age has also brought about new challenges in the realm of sexual consent and safety. The rise of sexting and the sharing of explicit images and videos online has created new risks, particularly for young people. Cases of revenge porn, where intimate images are shared without consent, have highlighted the potential dangers of digital communication and the need for stronger legal protections. At the same time, technology has also provided new tools for protecting privacy and ensuring consent, such as encrypted messaging apps and platforms that allow users to control how their images are shared and used. Virtual reality, VR, and artificial intelligence, AI, represent the next frontier in the evolution of sexuality in the digital age. VR technology has the potential to create immersive sexual experiences that go beyond traditional pornography, offering users the ability to explore their fantasies in a more interactive and realistic way. AI, meanwhile, is being used to develop sex robots and virtual companions, raising questions about the future of human relationships and the ethical implications of sexual interactions with machines. The impact of technology on sexuality is a complex and evolving issue, with both positive and negative aspects. On the one hand, technology has opened up new possibilities for connection, exploration, and self-expression. It has made it easier for people to find like-minded partners, access information about sexual health and education, and explore their desires in a safe and supportive environment. On the other hand, the digital age has also brought about new challenges related to privacy, consent, and the commodification of sex. The rapid pace of technological change means that society is constantly grappling with new questions about how to navigate these issues in a way that respects individual autonomy while protecting vulnerable populations. As we move forward into the 21st century, the relationship between technology and sexuality will continue to evolve. The ongoing development of new technologies, from AI to biotechnology, will likely bring about further changes in how people experience and express their sexuality. At the same time, the growing awareness of the need for ethical guidelines and protections will be crucial in ensuring that these changes contribute to a more inclusive, respectful, and fulfilling sexual culture. The digital age has fundamentally transformed the landscape of human sexuality, bringing both unprecedented opportunities and complex challenges. As we navigate this new world, it is essential to remain mindful of the ways in which technology shapes our relationships, identities, and experiences, and to work toward a future where everyone can enjoy the benefits of sexual freedom and expression in a safe and supportive environment. Sexuality has taken an incredible journey throughout human history, evolving from the sacred fertility rituals of ancient societies to the complex and often contradictory views of the modern world. What began as a deeply spiritual and communal act, closely tied to survival and the rhythms of nature, gradually became a matter of personal morality and societal control, especially as organized religions like Christianity and Islam began to shape strict codes around sexual behavior. The rise of classical civilizations like Greece and Rome introduced new ideas about love, power, and the human body, but it was the Middle Ages, with the Church's firm grip, that solidified many of the sexual norms we recognize today. As we moved into the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and beyond, these rigid views began to loosen, giving way to a more open and scientific exploration of sexuality. The 20th century's sexual revolution brought profound change, challenging old taboos and embracing new freedoms. Today, in the digital age, technology continues to reshape our understanding of sex, pushing boundaries and raising new questions. From ancient fertility rituals to the complexities of modern relationships, the journey of human sexuality reflects the ever-changing nature of human society. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of sexuality through the ages. If you found this journey as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do you think sexuality will continue to evolve in the future? Stay curious, stay open, and we'll see you in the next video.